Hello, and welcome to the inaugural Melbourne Music Summit. My name is John Nolan, and I'm the Director of Learning, Engagement and Innovation at the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. We just started with a beautiful musical acknowledgement of country by MSO's composer-in-residence, Deborah Cheetham. And Deborah joined us for that performance, which opened our 2020 season and was sung in the Bunwarang language. We're so excited to bring you the first ever Melbourne Music Summit. We had hoped to be able to gather in person tonight for Dr Anita Collins' opening keynote, The Music Advantage, but instead we're coming to you live from Canberra, Melbourne and Brisbane as we kickstart our week-long digital conference. MSO has always been a passionate advocate for music education, and this summit is our way of celebrating and hopefully inspiring our hardworking education community. I'm delighted to introduce the Victorian Deputy Premier and Minister for Education, the Honourable James Merlino, and the MSO's Managing Director, Sophie Gallais, to launch the inaugural Melbourne Music Summit.
Good afternoon, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra's Melbourne Music Summit. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which you are all located this afternoon. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and to any other elder present here today. Thank you to the MSO for inviting me to open this summit and for ensuring you can all attend in virtual form from wherever you may be today. Music gives a soul to the universe, wings to the mind, flight to the imagination, and life to everything. So said Plato more than 2,000 years ago. Those words really resonate now, and I'm sure you'll all agree that we've all gained an even greater appreciation of the vital role music plays in our lives over the past few months. With many of us largely kept to our homes, music has offered great solace, pleasure, and distraction from our concerns about the pandemic. Many of you may have seen the wonderful posts on social media of people in Italy singing songs together and playing music from their balconies while confined to their homes in the early days of the pandemic. More recently, you may have enjoyed some of your favourite musicians, including from the MSO, performing live on screen. Music lifts our spirits, gets us moving, and soothes our souls. It brings us together even when we all must be physically apart. There are few greater gifts we can give our children than an appreciation of music, not only for the pleasure music brings us. Research shows that a high-quality music education has so many benefits, including a greater awareness and appreciation of other cultures. It has social benefits. Countless friendships have been forged and strengthened through music. Music education has been shown to improve school attendance and engagement and better academic results across the board. That's why the Victorian Government is proud to support teachers across Victoria to build the resources, networks and experience to bring a high-quality music education to all our students. That's why this summit is such an important opportunity for you, our educators. And it's why I'm happy to announce today a new partnership between the Department of Education and Training and the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. The partnership is an element of the Andrews Government's Challenge and Enrichment series. For the first time, schools can refer high-ability students to a range of funded and high-quality extension activities, including through the MSO. This is just one part of the $60.2 million Student Excellence Program that is supporting our high-ability students across Victoria through structured online learning extension programs for students in years 5 to 8, professional learning for teachers in every school to build their capability to support high-ability students, increased school funding to support high-ability education in every primary and secondary school, and new awards for schools who excel in high-ability education. You'll be given more details about the partnership during the summit. I trust you will find the next 2 days a source of inspiration as you continue to ensure students reap the many benefits of music education. Thank you for your time and participation, and all the best.
Hello everyone, I'm Sophie Gallais, the Managing Director of the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, and would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands on which we stand. I wish to thank the Deputy Premier of Victoria and Minister for Education, the Honourable James Merlino, for his kind welcome. And I would like to thank you all for being here for our very first Melbourne Music Summit. It's a pleasure to have you with us this evening. Back when this event was just an idea, we could not imagine that this is how it would be delivered, virtually into your homes instead of at MSO's home in Melbourne. As the events of the last 6 months have unfolded, and as we've all had to adjust to a new reality of living and working, this event remain a priority for us to deliver. So we all hope that by the end of the week, you will come away with new insights, ideas, and inspiration to what music can do for you, your student, and your school community. Finally, I would like to thank and acknowledge everyone who has made this event possible. All our presenters, partners, and our wonderful MSO team. The MSO Learning, Engagement, and Innovation team have done a great job in pulling this together, ensuring that you hear from the very best in their field. Tonight, I invite you to get comfy, maybe with a glass of wine on the couch, and enjoy hearing from the brilliant Dr. Anita Collins. Thank you and good evening.
Thank you to the Minister and to Sophie for those messages. Now, this first ever Melbourne Music Summit is made possible by our generous summit partners, Berry Street Education Model, Conducting Artistry, the Victorian Department of Education and Training, and also the generous support of the Gwen and Edna Jones Foundation. As I said, this summit is designed to celebrate and empower those advocating for music within Australia's classrooms. So we couldn't think of a better way to start than with Dr. Anita Collins. Anita is an award-winning educator, researcher, and writer in the field of brain development and music learning. She's internationally recognised for her unique work in translating the scientific research of neuroscientists and psychologists to the everyday parent, teacher, and student. Tonight in her talk, The Music Advantage, Anita will give us an insight into her years of extensive research into music's effects on the brain, with particular regard to children's development. So we'll hear from Anita, but we also want to hear from you. So please add your comments or questions to the live chat on YouTube, and we'll have some time at the end of Anita's talk to ask her some of those questions. So now I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Anita Collins, live from Canberra, to the Melbourne Music Summit.
Thank you so much for having me, and I am so glad that this event has been able to happen in some form. It's such an important thing to keep these events going. We know that things are very difficult for us now, particularly in Melbourne, and I feel for you there. But it's very, very important that we keep our work going. We know we've had a pretty big bump in the road, but we know also that music education is so important for everybody and every single child, so we need to keep this going. This talk is one I have been looking forward to probably the most all year, and the reason is it's the very first time The Music Advantage, my new book, is out in the world. I've been doing lots of pre-records and interviews and stuff, but they don't come out until next week. This is the first event. So I'm really, really glad to be able to share it with you. I'm going to do some readings from it tonight and talk about sort of how I see advocacy and music education in Australia, some of the things we do well, some of the things we could think about a little bit more, but also just what has the science told us about music and learning and brain development and every single child. So I'd love to be able to share it with you. I know a lot of you have seen me present before, and I love coming to Melbourne. I love going all over Australia actually and presenting, but I get so much feedback and energy from the audience. So online presentations are hard for me. I will try my very hardest to be as engaging as possible, but I am really looking forward to, honestly, when I stop talking and you start asking questions. And that's the part where even as we go through, don't wait till the end and go, oh, what was my question again? Please send it in now. And I really look forward to that part of it. That's where I learn the most from you about what's interesting to you about music education. So let's start with our first slide. I put a whole bunch of questions up, and I ask myself lots and lots of questions all the time. It's like, what does that mean? How does that affect people? And this field of research really, really impacted on me because I honestly just wanted to be the best teacher I possibly could. And the more information I could get about learning and the more information I could get about how music impacts on the brain, and that's both negatively and positively, the better I would be able to be to teach my students. And what's important to me, and we have only just this past week returned to rehearsals, and this has taken a very long time in the ACT for us to come back. And honestly, I was worried. I was worried about that first note. It's like, what's it going to be like? We haven't seen these kids together since March. And what's that first note going to be like? And what's more, what's it going to be like when they're so physically separated, especially the younger kids where this is such a strange thing for them? I am so pleased to report that they rose to the occasion. They did such an incredible job in their rehearsals, and they dealt with everything. And they dealt with how strange it sounded. They dealt with how removed they were from sort of people they used to talk to all the time. I must admit there was less chatting in a rehearsal than I've ever heard before. They dealt with the sound delay, and they came up with solutions of how we could manage that. And I sat there and I thought, this is just another example of what music does for brain development and for children. They were resilient. They thought about ways that they could solve the problem. They thought about how everyone else was feeling in the rehearsal as well as how they were feeling. And the music that came out was fantastic. 45 minutes in, they started to get a bit tired, I must say, but they really did do an incredible job. So I want to start to talk about that research today, and I want to talk about it through, as I said, the really exciting part of the Music Advantage, which is my new book. So the title comes from a saying that's happening in the research at the moment called the musician's advantage. So it's this idea of what is the advantage that music gives to musicians. The other thing they're looking at is something called the musician's signature. They are very, very close to being able to say a musically trained brain in this kind of way looks this way. It has a signature. It is identifiably different, and different in a range of different ways that are mostly very, very positive. So the Music Advantage as a title came from that, from the musician advantage, which is sitting in the research. It's good to kind of at this point talk about what the research is for anyone who doesn't know. About 25 years ago, we had a sort of technological development, which means that we could watch the brain work in real time. And this was a few different parts of technology, EEGs, fMRI, PET scanners. And this opened up a massive door to the researchers to say, well, we can actually watch what happens in real time as we expose people to different things. And they tried all sorts of things, and they would see the kind of predictable thing. They'd say, look at this colour, and then they'd see the visual cortex light up, and that makes complete and utter sense. They would say, think about doing a movement, and they would see the motor cortices actually starting to activate just a little bit less than normal to say, I'm thinking about moving. But when they played a piece of music, everything went off. All the lights around the brain went off. And this is where the term the fireworks in the brain came from. And it was this idea that music was setting off the motor cortices, the visual cortices, the auditory cortices, 7 or 8 other networks around the brain, and those networks were talking to each other. They were responding to each other, and it was all done at such an incredibly low level that we didn't even know it was happening. We wouldn't be conscious of it. So what an incredible tool to help people start to understand how the brain talks to itself, really, how it remembers, gathers information, exchanges information, puts different parts of that information into context. Since then, now research takes a long time, and it takes a long time because you have to sort of come up with what's a possible area we need to look at, and then little small studies happen, and then slightly larger studies happen, and then particularly when it's with humans, we start with adults, and then we work our way down to working with children and even with babies. So we've reached a wonderful point, and what I think is probably going to be the 5 most exciting years of this research field, because we've reached that point of having large randomized longitudinal studies, which means we're working with children. We're not letting them pick music. We're saying randomly this group will do music and randomly this group won't. And we're doing it over 3 to 5 years. We're following their natural development. What we're finding is all sorts of different things are coming through. Anything from academic achievement, inhibitory control, the list goes on, social skills. And in many cases, the list is incredibly long. And I've had a lot of people say to me, well, how can it be that one activity does so many things? But when we think about the fireworks in our brains, if so many parts of our brains are working and going off at once, no wonder it's having multiple benefits for how the brain functions and how the brain ages. That's a whole different area, and I'd love to talk about that. We're going to stick with children today because the music advantage follows from birth until adulthood. Now, I haven't said that's 18, I've just said adulthood. So the music advantage is the idea that through musical training, the brain is enhanced in some way, shape or form, or impacted by music learning. And we're going to talk a little bit about what all those things are today. In an hour or so, I can only ever give you the headlines to what the wonderful benefits and skills are, but we can also talk about advocacy. And I've got some things at the end to talk about how do we talk about this so that other people, not musically trained people, can come to understand this research in a way that benefits all children. So that's the music advantage. The next slide sort of asks the big question, and this is getting to be a very big question right now. Are musicians just smarter people? And it's a fair question because when I was first thinking about doing some research and trying to find a field that I was really passionate about, this is the experience I had. And many, many teachers would have it. I would sit there on presentation night. And for all those music teachers out there, you know presentation night is a working night for you. Everyone else is kind of winding down, but you're ramping up to produce this amazing production. What would happen is I would be sitting, the orchestra would have played the national anthem and done all the things that happen in speech night and presentation night. I was sitting there watching, and all of the prize winners, so the top 10 students in year 7 would come up. And as a music teacher, and I had my fellow music teachers around me, what do you think I did? I sat there and I counted. 10 kids, how many do you think were musically trained? When I'm in an audience, I get people going 10, 9, 3, but the answer is usually the same. 7 or 8 of the students who were the top prize winners in non-musical subjects or across subjects were the ones that had achieved really, really well. And I just wondered, why is that so? Why does that happen? Does music have anything to do with it? Or literally, do the smart kids who were going to achieve well take up music? Now, in everything that I've said in the book, and you'll see it over and over and over again, it's become a bit of this and a bit of that. It's the two together. So children who are musically trained, we know, have brains that work more effectively. They work more consistently. They have better memory systems. Their synchronization is better. They age better. There's so many pluses in there. But were they born with that already? Or did that happen because of music learning? And the answer is absolutely both. We now know that genetics and personality play an enormous role in music learning, mainly because, if we can imagine, if a student is born, they have great inhibitory control. That means, or another term for it is impulse control. That means they're born with the ability to, you know, when they get frustrated, they don't just throw down the violin, hopefully they don't throw it, but they don't give up. They sit with the frustration, they sit with the discomfort, and they keep practicing. Anyone who's done practice know, essentially, musical skill doesn't come into it. It's just the ability to stick at it and keep practicing. Musically trained, or kids who take up music often and find it easy, or it looks easy, often have very high levels of auditory processing. So they can already hear the sounds really, really well, and the instrument is just allowing them to do that a little bit better. And again, it just looks easy. So there are kids who pick up instruments where all of their brain faculties, all of their networks are really well connected, and they just take up music and it just seems like an easy thing to do. But what happens to those kids who may have a deficit in one of those? For example, their auditory processing. More than likely, we'll see some issues with those sorts of kids with their spoken word. Their speech is is sort of, you can hear that it's not quite right. They can't hear the real nuances in there. They may move on to having some issues with reading, because if they can't speak it really well, the brain struggles to then read it really well. Now, what's most fascinating about this is those kids who have exhibit some of these problems, when they take up a musical instrument, sure, it might be hard at the start and it might not feel easy, but the impact of learning music has actually improved their auditory processing. Now, if we take that back, their auditory processing improves, their speech production improves, and probably their reading improves. So it is a bit of both. We can start life out with all of our brains connected as well as it possibly can be, and then music can seem easy. Or we can start with some deficits and music can be beneficial. Either way, to me, I can't see a reason why every child shouldn't have access to music education for that reason. So the next big question for me, how can music learning change our brains? Now, I mentioned a couple before, but let me go back to them because they're really important to understand. So first of all, the brains of musically trained kids and adults, even into later life, even when they've stopped playing their instruments, are higher in their consistency. Now, that's a strange word for the brain, but basically it means there's a hell of a lot of messages traveling around in our brains, and it's not 100% consistent all the time. If you just think about, say, a day when you're tired, maybe when you're hungry, maybe when you're distracted, that's that feeling for me of a lack of consistency. It's like the messages are just not getting through. Now, consistency in learning is very, very, very important, because a 6-hour day for learning, if they're really not firing all cylinders for maybe 4 hours in that 6 hours of the day, that learning is not as powerful as it could be. So consistency, really important. The next one is synchronization. Again, seems strange. Isn't our brain just like a machine and it works? No, there's a lack of synchronization that can sometimes happen. And again, it's that feeling of things are just not working right. Synchronization is really important for messages to get around the brain effectively, but also to do it quickly. So the next one is faster. Brain messages going around just that little bit faster means that students click onto a new concept really quickly, and they also make a memory of it really, really quickly. So those parts are very, very, very important. There's also a part of it being efficient. Now, as a musically trained person and not a scientist, I fully expected when I was reading all of the research that I would see that musicians used more of their brain to do a task than non-musicians. I was so wrong. It's the opposite way around. And when I thought about it, it made complete sense. Musically trained kids and adults use less brain energy to complete a task than non-musically trained children and adults. That means their brain is using less energy. It can either do two other things. It can go and do other activities, or it can rest. And we now understand that brain rest is incredibly important as well to learning. We can't be on the go all the time. Our brain needs to have weekends as well. So the changes are immense, and the changes are at a foundational level. On top of all of those sorts of changes, there are changes in the functions, so which particular networks are working faster than others or interacting with each other. There's changes in the structures. Some parts of a musically trained brain are larger and smaller. So there's a huge number of changes that are evident, and this is what scientists are trying to understand as the musician's signature. What does a musically trained brain look like and operate like? So the next one I'm going to do, we're going to change up a little bit. So I'm going to do some reading. 1+ from COVID. I got my eyes tested. It was way beyond time when I should have done it. But I can now read, and it's lovely. So here it is. Here's the Music Advantage. And what I'm going to do is read a couple of excerpts from you. So what I did, this book is for music teachers, absolutely, but it's not about how to teach music. It's not a how-to. It's very much talking about stories of learning, stories of teaching that I have been particularly privileged to be a part of, but also how the science kind of explains some of it, but also asks some questions and challenges us. So as many of you who I know are going to read the book in a little while, I struggle with reading off the written page. So I struggled to read when I was younger. And this was really, really tricky because my mother was a reading recovery teacher, and a reading recovery teacher is someone who helps kids who can't read to learn how to read. And my mum could not help me, and I was the firstborn in my family. So it was a very, very difficult time for us. I wanted to read, but I kind of pretended. I've tried to hide it, and I felt a little bit ashamed of not being able to read. But it was learning music, I think, that changed all of that for me. So when I was 9, I was given the opportunity to learn a clarinet, but I think even more importantly, I was given the opportunity to learn how to read music. Now, music is a symbol to sound system, meaning that we see a symbol, and inside our head, as soon as we see it, we hear that sound. We then talk to our body to make that sound, whether it's on an instrument or through our mouth as a speech sound. The very next thing that happens is that speech sound comes out and goes back into our ear for us to check if we've done the right thing. So learning to read, something happened. I learned to read music, and for me, music reading is bliss because there's no rules to break. It all just means exactly the same thing. Whereas reading English in particular, all the rules get broken all the time. So I say this because you're going to hear that sometimes I slip over my words or my eyes jump a little bit. And that's because I still work incredibly hard to read out loud from text. So the first story I'm going to tell you came from a principal that was, and the story was related to me. A wonderful story was related to me about an experienced principal and a student who was having a seriously bad day. This principal can handle anything. She has pretty much seen it all and runs a tight and happy school ship in an extremely challenging area. But on this particular day, she had a young girl in her office who was intensely angry. The principal was trying everything in her extensive book of behaviour management approaches, but the anger was only increasing. In a moment of what might have been intuition mixed with desperation, she started to sing quietly, and she would have probably said badly, but still she was singing. The spiral of anger instantly ceased, and a magical calm came over them both. This young girl did not need to be told what to do, to be lectured to be questioned. She needed to be sung to. What might have happened in this moment? I don't know for sure, but based on the extensive research into how song and singing impacts on our brains and bodies, being sung to made her feel safe in a space where she had lost both her internal control and her sense of connection. This experience reminds me of the studies that have been compared the time it takes for a baby to fall asleep if they are held and sung to, just held and rocked, or placed in their cots and sung to. The findings were that babies fell asleep faster and slept best when they were placed in their cots and sung to. There is a power to our singing voice. I really, really loved that story because it was about the power of music with people who weren't or wouldn't have perceived themselves to be musical. It was just the idea that music is so incredibly primal to us that we needed to use it in that moment, and no one stopped us. It wasn't about singing well. It wasn't about being perfectly in pitch. It was just about using song to connect. And that's what the research is starting to really explain to us, is about how music is so deeply held in our bodies, so very old in our brains, but also how important it is. And maybe how we can think about it a little bit more broadly when it comes to how music is needed, or is the place and purpose of it in every single person's life, all the way through their life. The next one I wanted to do for you, oops, we're going backwards. I love post-it notes, by the way. They're my favourite thing. Is a section from earlier on in the book. So I've divided the book into 4 sections, and the first one is about babies. So this is something that happened to me and I reflect on it very often because there were so many messages in it. The chapter is called The Power of Lullaby. It starts with a little kind of script. I said, "Do you sing to your baby?" The father said, "Yes, but only when no one can hear me." I said, "Your baby can hear you." The father said, "But he doesn't care. He doesn't know that my singing is terrible." How many people have heard that one before? I've heard it a few times. This is the sort of exchange I've had from dozens of parents. What I should also include are the non-verbal signals and the prosody, or prosody, whichever way you like, the melody and the rhythm of the father's voice. That also give me a great deal of information regarding how the father feels about singing to his infant son. Let me add those in. I said, "Do you sing to your baby?" with an open face to hopefully convey genuine interest and zero judgment. The father said, "Yes," with a big smile and a single word infused with recollection of a joyous experience, then a pause. "But only when no one can hear me," with a flat tone, a bit of a head shake, and a tiny step backward with a straightening of his back. I say, "Your baby can hear you." Quizzical, non-judgmental tone, but conscious to look off to the side and minimize any challenge. The father says, "But he doesn't care." Hands held open, slight shrug of his shoulders. "He doesn't know that my singing is terrible." A slight laugh in his voice and a small return to a recollection of a joyous experience. I can only go on my own interpretation of this exchange, but for me, I see a father who has experienced a profound connection with his infant son through singing, and who also may not feel completely comfortable sharing the joy that gave him with another adult, let alone a stranger. He loves it, but he's not sure he should. If I asked a mother the same question, the answer and underlying value judgment may be very different. In Western cultures, singing to our baby can be perceived as more appropriate or acceptable for a mother, especially in those first few months of life. It is often suggested as a good technique for soothing a baby to sleep. And while, of course, fathers use this technique, I wonder if singing in general carries less judgment for mothers than fathers. While this is a story about singing, I really think it's a story about a lot of things to do with music. We have this perception of female and male instruments. We have this idea that that it's okay for music to live within the sort of the mothering situation, or the way that a mother interacts with their children, but it's not okay for a father. And the number of fathers that I know that want to hide that they sing, but they love it. And a lot of this research makes me think about many of the myths and ideas that we've really started to have about music and where music lives and who's allowed to do it. And my hope is with this research, we can start to go, it's okay for a dad to sing. It's okay for a dad to hum. It's okay that it is a very, very primal old part of our being. And it should be part of every baby's development, because it's actually there as a connection tool. It's a way of feeling connected. Very recently, I saw a wonderful video. I'm a little bit of a Queen fan. That comes from my father, and good old Freddie Mercury was up there in Wembley Stadium, and he was doing this call and response that went on with the audience. And I don't know how many people, it must have been 200,000 people in the audience. And I watched it and I love it. It's a wonderful experience of seeing connection between people and one person holding the stage and holding the attention of everyone there. But the thing that got me about the research is what we now know is more than likely those 200,000 people who were singing together were synchronizing their heartbeats as they sung. I know what it feels like to be in a crowd that big, but to know that it's physiologically happening, something's happening inside of us, helps me understand why that's so incredibly special. And again, this is why this research to me is so helpful and so powerful. So the last one, again, we'll jump back with my wonderful post-it notes, is a little bit of an explanation about what's actually happening inside the musician's brain. I think for me, ultimately, what I want to get to is the point where I can say to a parent, Is music important for your child? And even now, the answer will always be yes, I think it's an important part of their education. But when I say why, they don't have an answer. I would love to get to the point where parents would start to, particularly those not musically trained, would start to have an answer to the why. And so through the book, I've tried to start to explain that next level down. Why does music learning have such an impact on the brain? So for these musicians out here, this is what's happening in your brain right now. Research into music learning and brain development started with adults, mostly professional musicians. This was because adult musicians were found to have brains that were wired very differently and highly effectively. And researchers wanted to learn more about what might have caused this. Again, it is a classic chicken and egg conundrum. Did smart people take up and excel at music learning, or did music learning change how their brains developed? One of the very first areas that researchers found to be highly developed in adult musicians was their inhibitory control. Anyone who has attempted to learn a musical instrument, including voice, will know how much discipline goes into that learning. You have to get it wrong again and again and again before you get it right. Even then, you might get it right on your Tuesday afternoon practice, but not be able to play it in your Wednesday morning rehearsal. It is infuriating and, it turns out, wonderfully instructive for our brains. One way the higher level of inhibitory control kicks in during the process of learning music is during the more frustrating and stressful parts of practice, when you just can't seem to get it right. Strong inhibitory control can stop us from giving up on a note we are trying to reach or the run of notes that we're trying to put together. And we might call this persistence or sticking with it. Whatever term you use, the inhibitory control is stopping musicians from giving up, walking away, or throwing in the towel. The little doses of frustration and stress that adult musicians have learned through many years of exposure help them to recognize, manage, and conquer future frustrations. It is like exposure therapy for frustration. But inhibitory control, is it inherited or learned? As I find myself saying so often in this area of development, it is most likely both. Research into genetics and individual personalities has shown that both factors play a significant role in the level of inhibitory control an individual possesses. And these levels could be a deciding factor when it comes to musically trained children who appear to find the activity easy or have what we might identify as talent. Another group of researchers has sought to test when and how inhibitory control might be affected by experience, specifically the experience of learning music, which appears to have some unique qualities. Inhibitory control more and more is becoming such an important part of learning. We have so many ways of accessing information now, so many different avenues, and we have this thinking around that we, should have access to everything. But in order to choose what to access and to pay attention to it and not get distracted by something else, we have to have incredibly high inhibitory control. Now, when COVID started, I was fascinated by the experience that kids were going to have at home learning music. I had some parents saying to me, well, they've now got heaps of time. Of course they'll do more practice. And I thought, really? Maybe some will. But a lot of others will actually find sitting down to practice when all the other rules have sort of gone out the window, really, really hard to do. And that's been the experiences they've come back and the stories that they've told. Inhibitory control is such important and should be an incredibly highly valued skill. And musicians learn it just a little bit every single day. So again, here's an example of how music learning has impacted on the brain. So enough from that. There's so many more stories in there. I hope you enjoy them. We're going to move on to some myths. So a lot of the time, I am more interested in what belief is sitting underneath what someone said rather than what they've said. They say something, it's like, what is informing that? Where's it coming from? What is making you believe that? And music's a fascinating one because music goes right to our core and it goes literally into the oldest part of our brain. And the really important part is to remember that because it's going to the oldest part, it's bypassing a whole bunch of other things along the way. So that's why we can, in maybe 2 or 3 beats, decide if we like a piece of music or we don't. And we do it by saying, does it match with something else that I've heard? And do I like the other thing? Therefore, I like this one. But we do it really, really quickly. But we have these, what I call myths. We may use some other words for them, but they're beliefs that we have that I feel like are holding us back. The first one is music should only be learned by the musically talented. Now, as a myth, this is jam-packed for me. What does musically talented mean? How do we find that out? Does it have to do with how much practice they do or how many notes they can play at once? Why should only the musically talented be the ones who learn music? Are they only the ones who are going to go on and make a career out of it? And so it brings up so many things for me about where music sits in our understanding, why we should study it and understand it and experience it in childhood. And a lot of the time it will be the direct line. And I find it fascinating. Year 10 parent coming to me saying their child is not going to study in year 11 and 12, and the answer will almost always be because they're not going to be a professional musician. And I have to wheel it back and say, that's not the only point of learning music. And another point I say, well, they're going to study maths, so they're going to be a professional mathematician? Oh, no, but you need maths. It's like, well, let's think about the different parts of that. So we have this idea that studying music, like studying art and studying drama, must lead to a professional career, rather than it can assist a year 11 and year 12 student to have a really effective, good learning experience through a very, very stressful time that they're about to have in their final years of secondary school. And it can maintain their social group that they really, really need during that time as well. They're just two of the reasons. There are lots of different reasons. Again, I also come back to this musical talent part and the idea that, well, if we're born with predispositions for music, high auditory processing, high inhibitory control, for example, there's a big list of those, and that child is given the opportunity to learn music through the fact that their parents may be able to pay for it, or it may be available at their school for a long, long period of time, many years, then are they musically talented? Or is it just that they've had the predisposition and the opportunity? What happens if someone hasn't got the predisposition but enormous opportunity? Does that make them musically talented? There's so much that's in this sort of statement that we need to think about. And I think it has to do with a lot with the words that we use. I find it fascinating, and for my fellow music teachers that are out there, just think about this question for a moment. Would you call yourself a musician? The reason I ask it is because a lot of music teachers don't. And it's like, why is that? What is feeding that? You play music, you make music, you teach music, that makes you a musician. But we have this idea that a musician needs to be someone who does it professionally and is recognised for that. So again, for music teachers, let's have a think about that idea of what does musician mean. The next myth, which is coming up a lot during COVID, I must say, and it's interesting to see what things rise to the surface when we get into a very stressful situation and we need to make value judgments and decisions. There was an infamous, and I will say infamous, quote, and I won't quote it word for word, but it was about the idea that with parents at home when they were, helping their children, don't worry about all the other subjects, worry about the important ones, which were listed as English, maths, and science. The thing that gets me is that learning those things at home, if you remove the music learning part out, is actually going to make them harder and less effective. You're not supercharging your child's brain for learning. You're not helping them to deal with the stress that's coming up from everything to do with the pandemic. And you're not helping them to continue to live with that discomfort. And the less they live with it, the less good they get at managing it when it comes to something that's difficult in English or something that's hard in their science homework. So the concept of extra versus essential. It lives in a couple of different places. One is music is sometimes done outside of school. It's not an in-school subject. And if it is, it may have less time than other subjects. It may have less lessons in the week or the cycle. Another part comes to the fact that if there's something going on, and I've seen this very, very frequently in primary schools, and it could be anything like school photos, vaccinations, coming out for an excursion, the day that is picked is often the day that has most of the music and arts subjects in it, because it's okay to miss those. And that as a value judgment is not okay with me. I just forgot my next one, but I will remember it. Then another part is how many students are able to do it up into year 11 and year 12. And a lot of that has to do with timetabling. I'm quite fascinated by, in many cases in schools, the timetabler has an enormous amount of power. Which subjects are put against other subjects, what value judgments are being made in there. So I think at the moment we have a whole bunch of beliefs and myths that are feeding into this idea that music is on the outside, is an extra, is an add-on. And we need to think about what this research is telling us, what that research looks like in the real world. And that's a very important thing to think about, because research is research and lives in a certain space and is done for a certain reason. We as educators are the ones who need to look at that research and implement it authentically and with an understanding of its limitations. So that's an important myth to me as well. The last one, which is my bugbear, I taught teacher education for 12 years and loved it to bits. And I particularly loved my generalist teachers because they were coming into my classes with a real set of values around music education and their delivery of music education. How responsible were they? How important was it? How much attention should they pay? And I did a survey at the start of every single one of the semesters, and I would say music should be, and then they got to fill it in. I didn't even give them like a list of words. They just got to fill in whatever word that came to mind first. 90% of them said music should be fun. And I now came to hate the word fun. Because it's like, why? If you change music learning and put it to science learning or history learning or physical education learning, do you have the same word on the end? Oh, no. And scarily, a lot of them said maths learning should be hard. So our teachers come in with a lot of these ideas, but particularly about music learning, the idea that it should be fun. And when it's not fun, that's when you give up, because it's not delivering what you believe it should be delivering. Happens a lot with parents. I get the very common statement, often after a concert. I don't know if you've had this experience, but wow, this is the hardest one to deal with. Big concert, great applause, everything's gone so well. You've worked for weeks, if not months, to get to that performance. You're packing up chairs at the end, and one of the parents comes up and says, great performance, well done, that's fantastic. By the way, Samuel won't be continuing next term because he's not having any fun anymore. It's like, I'm packing up chairs. I've just delivered you the most amazing performance and the kids have done so well. How do I come back, to then talk about this? It's such a difficult situation. I think we need to start talking about the benefit of, as I've mentioned a few times, frustration, little microdosing on frustration to learn persistence and resilience. So many schools are using programs to teach both of those things. And here's my question. We've got music education, which does it like easily. Why do we have to buy in a new program, upskill everybody? We could have a music program that could give you performance opportunities, could help the kids learn so many different things, but also build persistence and resilience. So the word fun is very, very dangerous, and one I feel like we need to work with and get out of the thinking for our parents that fun is not what it's there for. It's actually there to grow these very, very important, very useful skills in adulthood. No more fun. Lots of whack. No, really. It's great fun. So last of all, I've got some thoughts on the words we use. And these are just thoughts which I would love you to think about when you're speaking. Think about when you're saying, what am I writing about when it comes to music education? And the first one is, we often talk about the benefits of music education. There are books written about it. There are infographics, there are posters, there are lists, there's heaps and heaps of things there. But I think maybe the word benefits is getting in our way, because if I turn it around, could we list the benefits of regular exercise? Probably, because we've probably heard them a lot. But just because we know the benefits, does that get us into action to get out of bed at 6 o'clock in the morning and go for a run? Not necessarily. So I'd like to contemplate the idea that instead of using the word benefits, we think about the word skills. What are the non-musical skills that music learning can help our children develop? And then follow that up with why and how. The next one I really want to look at is, again, a term that's used very often. Every child deserves music education. And I understand that word. I understand the use of the word deserve. But as I read more and more of this research, it's like saying we deserve ice cream at the end of dinner. If we don't have it, it's like it's not going to be the end of the world. But I'm starting to wonder if not having music education for every child in a meaningful, ongoing, sequential way is actually not ice cream, it's the whole dinner. It's not allowing our students to develop the foundational cognitive abilities that will serve them through life. So what about if we started thinking about every child needs music education? And how does that change how we advocate for it? The very last one is one I'm playing with because, as I say, music teachers don't call themselves musicians, so who does? So does that mean our students don't call themselves musicians? We often refer to them as our musicians. So this idea of a musician, it has a lot of boundaries on it. Professionalism, highest level possible, you know, getting your Elmas at the age of 6, you know, it's all these areas that are really bound up in that word musician. So what if we started to play with musically trained and think about what that actually might mean? There are an enormous number of doctors. I go to hospitals all the time, and the very first question I say is, who learnt a musical instrument for more than 5 years? You know what happens. We have hands going up everywhere. But they're not learning their musical instrument necessarily to be a musician. They've become a doctor. I could go to lots and lots of other professions and see that as well. So let's think about musically trained and not the word musician. And again, it's just to see what happens to someone else when you use that term. How do you use that term differently and talk about music differently? It doesn't change what music education is. And while I talk a lot about the non-musical benefits of music education, I do not believe for 1 second that it takes away from the very innate, wonderful part that is the art form and the reason why everyone should be learning it. They live together for me. Where they come apart is who's the person I'm talking to and what do they care most about. And that's where we should be using all of the research that we possibly can. So last of all, I think this slide's going to go up on the screen. The music advantage, I just want to like hug it. I'm still very excited, is coming out on September the 1st. And it's very much for parents and teachers and for students as well. Let me not forget grandparents. It's an easy read, and I made it that way specifically so that people could approach the research and understand it from a real life point of view. I want to be at the point where a grandparent writes to me and say, I saw my child practicing their instrument and I understood what might be happening in their brain as they tried and tried and tried again to get that note. And then when they did, I understood that the reward network in their brain kicked in and they had this amazing internally created high about what they'd just been able to achieve. That's what I would love to see as a change that actually happens from all of this research being shared. The other part that I do is with Bigger, Better Brains, and this is very much for teachers and very much for giving them the resources, but also an education in research itself, how to approach it, how to read it, how to see where its limitations are when we start to talk about it. Well, I can talk quite happily all day long about this field of research. It's so important to me that you out there in your communities where you have the trust and you have the authorities, you can talk about this research in a way that will resonate with your parents, with your teachers, and with your school leaders. So, how many people have put questions in? This is what I'm excited for. This is my excited time, because questions are where I really start to understand what it is that you're looking for and the little bits that you want explained. So I'm hoping we can move on to questions and that there are a lot there.
Fantastic. Anita, I'm not sure if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you so much for that. That was just absolutely amazing.
Thank you.
Wonderful. And there have been heaps and heaps of questions. So, so I've got them here on my iPad. So Sam says, hi Anita, you mentioned that you find reading music much easier than reading text. What is the quickest way to learn how to read music?
Oh, I'm so not the person to ask. I don't know. I've watched, that's a fascination for me to watch how kids nut out the code, because language is a code and music is a code. It's all the same thing. And I talk about in the book about this thing called a cognitive click, which is they can't get it, they can't get it, they can't get it. And then one day they just goes dunk and everything falls into place. So I don't think there's one way. As I'm learning with all this research, there's no one way to anything, but it's having that repertoire of different ways of trying it, even if it's singing it first and then following it. Some kids I get fascinated with, they can't follow the notes. They can sing them in time, but their fingers behind. And I sit there going, I cannot do that. But that tells me more about what's happening in the connection between their ears and their body and their eyes.
Okay, great. Well, look, a question that's sort of come up a lot throughout your talk in sort of various forms, and that you sort of answered for us at the end there, is just that question about how we get this research out there, how we get this out into the mainstream, how we convince people of this. And you know, and I think you've sort of covered that a little bit, but if there's anything more you want to add there.
Oh, so much more. How much time have we got? So I do a lot of reading around, I guess it's called sort of like campaigning, but it's very much about how we change people's minds and how we come to understand how that changes. So I think for me, it has two sides to it. One is we are trained educators. Let's use our superpower in a way that can really, really help. So constantly having little bits of research that you write about. We share lots of things, so just chuck that in your social media feed. But sharing it a lot. It's like, here's our brain tidbit for the week, or here's what we're going to focus on memory this week, and here's all the different things that we've found. So there's ongoing kind of education plan. Then there's the one-off event. And that's like that one where the parent comes up at the end of the concert and you go, oh, don't ask me that now. You can't say, I'll be back in 2 or 3 days when I've amassed all of the research I need to convince you that your child shouldn't give up. You have to answer in the moment. And that's where, honestly, first thing, take a breath, put the chair down and think about, okay, what's most important to this parent? Where's this come from? And what do I actually want to come out of this? You want a further conversation for sure, but I often start with, tell me more. What's happening at home that, you know, makes you think that Samuel's not having a good time with his practice? And then you start to get into the larger story of what's happening. And then the more little bits of information, honestly, it's a funny thing, but we tend to remember these little tidbits when we have to. Our brain goes, oh, got to work really hard now. And that's when those little bits of research can come in, but we have to answer in the moment. That's why, while it's great to send around videos and it's great to watch things, it's that person to person, that teacher to parent moment when you go, this is my teachable moment with you. What can I do? How can I help you understand? Is where it's really important. So ongoing education and then seat of your pants advocacy.
Oh, fantastic. And I think, you know, at MSO, one of the things we really wanted to get out of tonight and the next couple of days is sort of helping our teaching community to be, you know, equipping them to be better advocates for music education. So I think, you know, hearing that, what you've just said and in your talk is amazing. Another question that's come up a few times in a couple of different forms is about the benefits of sort of singing as opposed to instrumental music? Is that
That's usually question number 2.
Yeah.
It's like, so what about singing? It's a really, really good question. So the answer is they've studied singers and they've studied instrumentalists. They've done a lot more study on instrumentalists, the reason being that we have to always remember the research has been done by neuroscientists and psychologists to understand how the brain works, not to understand how music learning happens. So it's a tool for them to use. We then can take the research and understand more about what we do, but it's not directly related. So they found very early on that playing an instrument involves far more of the brain, more activity, more hard work. And so therefore that's why they liked it more when it came to studying it. The end point we're at the moment is learning a musical instrument absolutely supercharges the cognitive capacities of our brain. Learning to sing supercharges the social aspects, the connectivity between human beings, the connection that we feel, and also the immune system. So as an educator, I look at it and go, singers should play an instrument and instrumentalists should sing. And that should be where we start. It's not an either or, it's we do both.
Well, fantastic. I've got a question, quite a specific question here from Samantha, who asks, may I ask if there has been any research in how music is beneficial for special needs students?
Yes.
For improving consistency and or development in the brain, especially where there may be challenges in learning?
Yes, Samantha, absolutely huge amount. And it's really, sometimes I just want to go and do a presentation just on that. But music learning for a very long time has been used in a therapeutic way for kids with ADHD, children with autism in particular, and now we re-understand the spectrum, it's being used even more. Dyslexia in particular as well. So there's a huge amount of research from an interventionary point of view. I've had the personal experience, and I'm really looking forward to further research in this, that some of the schools I work in, we put a music program in, and for 6 months or so, it's not education, it's therapy. It's bringing the kids into a safe space. It's helping their connectivity if that's where the issue is. For some of them, it's auditory processing. For some of them, it's not throwing the instrument when they get frustrated. It's therapeutic. And then it kind of morphs at a particular point into education. So I'm really fascinated about bringing music therapy and music education a bit closer than they are at the moment, in this idea that we can benefit kids not in an interventionary way and not in a sort of coming out of class to do something, but actually in a whole class and then a whole school experience. So, and I've seen it happen in several challenging schools now, and it has transformed the school entirely, not just the kids that have been sort of diagnosed with special needs. So yes, very specific research, Samantha, is out there. It's great research, really, really rigorous, but I also think we're looking at a new phase as well.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. This is my favourite question. How does someone become a neuromusical educator?
Considering I had to make up my title, I think you make it up as you go along. Just to share my process, I, as I said, searched for a topic which I would love as much at the end as I did at the start. And I still do, because I still wake up and I don't get out of bed before I've read all my research alerts. I did my PhD in it, and then I was very, very lucky to be given a Churchill Fellowship, and something all of you should look into doing. It's the most incredible gift in the world. You get to travel wherever you want to experience or learn more about your specific field, with the whole idea that you come back to Australia and you make Australia better through your experience. And I think what drives me every single day is I was given that gift by the Churchill Trust, and I need to keep paying it back because it truly changed my life. And what I went and did is I visited the labs. Now, I'm a teacher and a musician, and anyone who knows music teachers, we're quite talkative and gregarious and we're quite out there. Switch to neuroscientific researchers who spend all of their time in windowless rooms looking at like data. And I would go into these, I just had a wish list and I went, I'm going to go to all these places. And I would go and spend 4 days, and it was the same every single time. They would be really proper and they would talk to me about their research and they would explain things. It was great for the first 2 days. And then by the third day, they relaxed and they went, oh, she knows what she's talking about. Wait, this is fine. And then I would get the real research that came through. Things like we're now looking at the fact that we could have a DNA test for dyslexia. We could know before a child is born if they are, or what likelihood they would have of having dyslexia. And we can put a music intervention in way before they get to school and they get to reading. Those are the gems. So I did that and I got to do it again. And then I just fell in love with it. And it became something that I think everyone should be able to access and should be able to share. So yeah, let's make more neuromusical educators, please.
Well, look, there's been some really lovely comments as well as questions. So Rose Popsy said, thank you for paying it back, Anita, which is absolutely lovely. We've had Nancy Callow with a top tip saying, I tell parents that their child is not missing class for their instrumental lesson. They are gaining a half hour of one-on-one expert and focused teaching from a high standard professional. And there was a sort of, someone posted what I thought was a heartbreaking sort of quote earlier in the event where they said, you know, what they often hear is that she needs to quit music to focus on her studies.
Studies, yeah.
And that it's like a broken record. And I suppose that's where what you were saying before about, you know, having it ready to go in that moment, do you have anything to add to that? It's such a common thing. And sometimes I've tried to write all these ones down, and as soon as you rattle them off, I just have all these heads bobbing in the audience because we've all heard them before. And again, it's back to what's informing that decision or that statement, and what do they believe music is taking away from their child, rather than can we change the narrative to this music is giving your child. And that's the most important thing. I think we're on the back foot a lot of the time, and I think we can get right on the front foot and turn things around. But even with parents, I say, tell me more. What do you think's happening for your child? What's happening for you? The one I get about, I often think is your child giving up their instrument, or are you giving up their instrument? You can't necessarily say it like that, but it's a question of what's happening at home, what's happening for the child, what's happening for the parents, and how can I as the music educator help with that? Fantastic. Look, we've had a few questions about music and music education in lockdown, and quite a few lovely comments about how, you know, it's sort of tying into what you were saying before, become a kind of therapy. I've now just lost the question. So Jonathan Harvey is asking, how can you maximise music education while students are in lockdown? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the regularity, it's a bit like exercise. In lockdown, you know, you have such strict rules around you, but if you don't go out for exercise every day, that's not just for your body to move around, it's for your mental health. Music is a little bit the same like that. It's about finding ways that work for children to keep them enthused. We had a lot of our kids do partner practice. So they would set a time every single day. They'd get their phone, they'd do a FaceTime call, and they would play to each other or they'd play together, which was hilarious when the delay happens, but they would co-practice. And the practice part wasn't important. It was the social interaction that they would have had as a normal part of class. That was really, really important for them to do. Some kids, kids have done all sorts of different ways, but I think it's the regularity. And even if it is 5 or 10 minutes, that's going to be really, really important. Also, if you're home with your kids, get your kids to teach you how to play their instruments.
Oh, fantastic. I'm just waiting for some more questions to come through. So if anyone's there with burning questions, please pop them online quickly. But there have been quite a few of those comments around music in lockdown. So that's really, really great to hear about. Let me just have a quick look. We've had some more lovely comments. We've had Rosemary Inverson saying, bravo, Anita, an insightful and much needed dose of optimism to our musical fraternity in lockdown.
Thank you so much.
I think I suppose, Anita, just one last question from me. You know, as I said, we really want to equip our education community to be really great advocates for music education. So, and you've given us so much on that already, but is there any sort of other final kind of thoughts that you want to share?
Yeah, I think I mentioned before this idea of teaching is our superpower. And I think a lot of people would have giggled or it just would have passed them by. But I think we forget that we are so highly skilled at what we do. We have if you think about it, so much training. If we think about our own musical training ourselves and then how much we've actually done. But we do an incredible thing, really, really an incredible thing. And I think a lot of the time I see teachers either not thinking it's as incredible as it is, or feeling like they're not as important, feeling like they're not as valued, thinking that a comment like, you know, my child's going to give up because it's not fun, or I don't want them to come out of class, any of those comments is a reflection on ourselves. But it isn't. It's actually a reflection on what the general public understands about our art form. So I think we can flip the story, and I often call it flip the narrative. We can flip it around to saying, how can we, with our superpower as teachers, help educate the general public about what is that we do, and the enormous, and I'm going to use the word benefits, but the enormous gift, if we want to use that word, that we give to these students for the rest of their lives. And we often don't see it later on, maybe when they're 30 or 40, and going, you know what, my music teacher really taught me something. I met someone today who's a photographer, and he talked about his teacher back 20 years ago. He said, I just did not realize what he taught me, but he taught me so much. And we as music educators, we either don't hear that because it's so far in the future, or we dismiss it. And what I would hope that everybody out there, especially during this summit, especially during this very, very difficult time, is recognize that you have an incredible gift. We just have to find a way for others who don't experience that gift to at least understand it, and from understanding comes respect. So please, if you take nothing else away, I believe in you and I believe what you do is important. Let's help other people understand that.
Oh, thank you, Anita. I'm sure, hopefully everyone watching is finding that very inspiring. Another question that we have had asked many times tonight is, how can people buy your book, and when will it be available in Europe?
It's available in Australia on September the 1st. And there's an ebook and there's a paper book. If you're a post-it note girl like me, go for the paper book. You can write all over it. And then I know that we are having lots of talks and negotiations about it being spread around the world. And I know already it's going to go to the US, which is very exciting. And then as we come out of lockdown as well, things will start to happen as well. So I'm doing more readings on my Facebook page for the rest of this week. So if you want a few more tidbits, they'll be there. But yeah, we'll share it as much as we possibly can, and lots and lots of stories will come from it as well, I'm sure.
Fantastic. And Anita, if there are other questions tonight that we haven't been able to get to, is there a way people can be in touch with you to ask those?
Yes, absolutely. Come to my website, anitacollinsmusic.com, and you can put any of your questions in there, and I try to get to every single one of them that I can. Any questions you've got or any research you'd like to be able to access, I know it is very, very hard sometimes if you haven't got a university login. And you want something, please write that in there as well. But Bigger Better Brains, go and check that out, because we have a bunch of stuff that's free, lots and lots of things to watch, large number of videos, heaps of fact cards, all sorts of things you can download, which you can start that sharing in your community, and just make it a campaign. Make it something where you go, every single week I'm going to do this one little thing to help my community, whoever that community might be, understand the research that I've heard about and the stuff that I want to share with you.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much, Anita. It's been absolutely so inspiring hearing from you.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. There's been lots and lots of love on YouTube, lots of thank yous, lots of power to you, Dr. Collins.
Wonderful.
And lots of thank you for all of the wonderful things you've been saying about the importance of music educators. So sadly, that brings us to the end of the opening event of the Melbourne Music Summit, but today is just day one. We do still have 4 days of events with leading educators and with members of the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra ahead of us. So all of these events are free. I believe registrations have actually closed now, but if you're really keen to attend any of those events and you haven't signed up, you can email schools@mso.com.au and my colleague Stephen will help you out. So I'd like to thank again Anita for that inspiring, galvanizing presentation and for those wonderful responses to all of your questions. Also, I have to thank all of our wonderful teams in Canberra, Brisbane and Melbourne tonight who have done a wonderful job of enabling this event to go ahead despite the restrictions in place across Victoria. I'd also like to again thank our wonderful Melbourne Music Summit sponsors, without whom this week's events wouldn't be possible, and they were Berry Street Education Model, Conducting Artistry, the Victorian Government's Department of Education and Training, and of course the Gwen and Edna Jones Foundation. Of course, as well, thank you to all of you for joining us for this evening. We'll see you again tomorrow, hopefully, for day 2 of the Melbourne Music Summit. In the meantime, stay safe and good night.